They called it an honor. In reality, it was a slaughter. Boys dragged from their homes, pinned to the ground, and cut until they were no longer sons, no longer men, no longer human. Their screams filled the palace walls, but silence was demanded, for silence created eunuchs. And eunuchs became the empire's darkest weapon. What was taken from them did not kill desire, it twisted it. Their mutilated bodies carried secrets of lust, power, and betrayal so disturbing, history itself tried to erase them. There are moments in human history where cruelty disguises itself as necessity, where the destruction of flesh becomes the foundation of empires. In the palaces of ancient China, such moments began not with ceremony nor with divine sanction, but with the sound of a blade tearing into living skin. The eunuch was not born, he was created through pain, mutilation, and blood. His life began again only after his body had been broken. And so, the story of these men begins not with words of duty or honor, but with the suffocating silence that follows screams too terrible to describe. The ritual of castration was not a clean cut of medical precision. It was closer to a battlefield wound, a crude severing of a boy's most intimate identity. Many of those chosen were barely more than children, sometimes no older than 9 or 10. They were stripped down, held by relatives or by hired attendants, and forced to the ground where straw mats could not soak enough of the blood that poured from them. There was no anesthetic, no balm, no understanding of infection. The procedure was done with a single knife, sometimes rusty, sometimes sacred, depending on the hand that wielded it. Some died before the wound could even be bound, their short cries fading into stillness. Others lived on but carried scars deeper than any flesh could bear. These boys would never again be considered whole. To become a eunuch was to become less than human in the eyes of many, but paradoxically more useful in the eyes of power. The castration was both punishment and promise. It was punishment because it stripped away everything society expected of a man, the ability to father, the capacity to carry a lineage, the possession of virility. But it was also promise because in the twisted logic of empire, mutilation meant trust. A eunuch could not seduce a concubine or father a bastard child to taint the royal bloodline. His body, ruined by the knife, became a symbol of loyalty forged in torment. The emperor did not see a boy crying on the floor, but a servant remade in silence. The horror, however, was not confined to the moment of cutting. Infection spread like fire in the days after, and death claimed many slowly, with fever and festering wounds. Those who survived bore permanent physical agony. The removal of both penis and testicles, called the complete cut, meant the body would never again pass urine with ease. Every relief was an ordeal, requiring the insertion of reeds or straws into scarred flesh. Pain was constant, humiliation endless. What empire deemed useful, the boy himself experienced as unending suffering. Here lay the first paradox of the eunuch's existence, exalted in court, despised in flesh. To understand the horror of this transformation, one must also understand its context. Ancient China, with its obsession for order and hierarchy, sought control over every aspect of life. The harem, filled with hundreds of women, represented both pleasure and danger. It was the heart of imperial reproduction, and therefore the site of political vulnerability. The eunuch was the solution. His mutilation a safeguard against scandal, his suffering a guarantee of purity. Yet behind the reasoning lies the darkest truth. The empire demanded the sacrifice of children's bodies to preserve its illusion of perfection. An empire was guarded not by armies alone, but by the mutilated silence of the castrated. The psychological toll was as brutal as the physical. Imagine a boy waking to find his childhood gone, his future destroyed. No wife, no children, no legacy, only service, suspicion, and the memory of pain. He would be defined by absence, the absence of manhood, the absence of heirs, the absence of choice. In that absence grew bitterness, envy, and a hunger for influence. The silence imposed at the blade's edge often returned later as whispers of intrigue in palace corridors. The horror of castration did not end with blood, it continued in the way it warped ambition and reshaped the soul. Society outside the palace did not forgive. Eunuchs were mocked as half-men, pitied as monsters, excluded from the rituals of family and ancestor worship. Their names rarely carried forward, their spirits often believed to wander restless after death, unable to join their forefathers. In life, they were tools of the court. In death, they were orphans of eternity. The human cost, then, was not only in the screams of the procedure, but in the slow erasure of identity. The blade did not merely cut flesh, it cut away belonging, and yet, in this mutilation lay power. For every boy broken, the palace gained a guardian of secrets, a man who owed his survival only to imperial favor. The silence of the eunuch was not simply the silence of mutilation. It became the silence of complicity, of observing every hidden act in the palace, of carrying knowledge too dangerous to speak aloud. In this silence lay terror, for the eunuch's suffering gave him license to enforce suffering upon others. The knife that mutilated him became a metaphor for the role he would play, cutting away the humanity of all who entered the palace's shadow. As this chapter closes, the listener must understand one truth: eunuchs were not an accident of history. They were manufactured horrors, born from a deliberate system that saw mutilation as policy. The empire did not stumble into this cruelty. It demanded it, perfected it, and used it to build dynasties. But in doing so, it planted a seed of corruption that would later consume it from within. The blood spilled at the moment of castration was not simply the blood of a child. It was the blood of a civilization carving its own scars into history. The silence that followed was not peace. It was the silence of trauma, of obedience born from terror, of shadows that would one day rise to choke the very emperors they were made to serve. They came from the poorest corners of the empire, children who should have been chasing insects in the dust or laughing at the river's edge. Instead, they were led by trembling hands into the shadows of the palace gates, sold not as sons but as sacrifices. In ancient China, poverty was not simply hunger. It was the knife that could turn a child into a commodity. Families with too many mouths to feed looked upon their youngest boys with silent calculation. What could be exchanged for grain? What life could be mutilated so that others might survive? And so countless children were traded away, condemned to a fate more terrible than death. The transaction was deceptively simple. For a handful of coins or a promise of protection, a boy's body was surrendered to the imperial machine. Mothers clutched their sons until the last possible moment, their tears falling onto small faces too young to understand. The fathers rarely spoke, their silence betraying both complicity and despair. Some parents convinced themselves it was mercy, better a son inside the palace than starved in the fields. But beneath the rationalizations lay a brutal truth. They were condemning a child to be unmade. The palace did not buy sons. It bought silence, mutilation, and obedience. Once chosen, these boys were not regarded as human beings but as raw material for empire. They were marched to the places of cutting, where the act of castration was carried out with blades crude and unmerciful. The surgeons who performed the procedure were not healers but executioners of childhood. There was no anesthesia, no antiseptic, only rough hands and sharp metal. Many boys bled out in agony, their small bodies unable to endure the sudden violence. Survivors were often crippled with infection, forced to lie in filth until the wound closed, if it ever did. The empire had little concern for those who did not endure. The dead were discarded, the survivors remade. But survival was not salvation. For the boy who lived, something greater than flesh was taken. His manhood was cut away, his voice broken, his future erased. He would never father children, never know the warmth of a wife, never carry on the lineage of his ancestors. In a society where family and bloodline were sacred, this mutilation was not only physical but spiritual. A eunuch was severed not only from his body but from the chain of generations, cast adrift as an outcast who could neither belong to the world of men nor the world of women. His very existence became a haunting reminder of sacrifice turned into servitude. Not every child became a eunuch through poverty. Others were condemned by punishment, victims of imperial decree. A father who offended the law might see his sons taken and cut, their mutilation serving as both vengeance and warning. Criminals who had angered the throne could be offered the knife as an alternative to death, a grotesque form of mercy that traded a swift end for a lifetime of humiliation. In these cases, castration was not just a punishment of the body, but a branding of the soul, turning rebellion into obedience and inscribing fear into every household that watched. What emerged from this system was a class of broken children raised without innocence. They entered the palace not as boys, but as wounds wrapped in cloth. Their bodies carried scars that never healed, and their minds bore memories of betrayal. To them, the palace walls did not represent opportunity but imprisonment. They had been purchased by an empire that thrived on their silence, and every stone of the forbidden city seemed to whisper of bargains struck with blood. These children were reshaped into tools, guardians of harems, keepers of secrets, instruments of suspicion. Their lost childhood was not an accident of history, but the very foundation of their role. The cruelty of this system is not only in the act itself, but in the philosophy that justified it. By stripping these children of their manhood, the empire sought to strip them of ambition, desire, and legacy. It believed mutilation could manufacture loyalty. Yet history reveals the opposite. The very act of castration created beings who existed in a liminal state, neither fully trusted nor fully despised, always feared, always resented. These children grew into men whose lives had been stolen, and their service carried within it the bitterness of betrayal. In every whisper of intrigue, in every manipulation of power, one can hear the echo of childhoods mutilated for survival. Consider the mothers who lived with the memory of selling their sons. Their grief was a private horror, a silence they carried for the rest of their lives. They had condemned their children not to death but to something far crueler, survival without humanity. And consider the boys themselves, growing into adulthood with the knowledge that their suffering had been a transaction, that the people meant to protect them had sold them to the knife. This is the darkest wound, one deeper than any blade could cut, the betrayal of blood. The empire justified this cruelty by necessity. It required eunuchs to guard the harems, to serve within the most intimate chambers of the court, to exist as shadows without lineage or temptation. But beneath this logic lies a haunting reflection of human society at large. When power demands sacrifice, it always consumes the powerless first. It is always the children of the poor, the sons of the condemned, who are offered to the blade. Their innocence becomes currency, their suffering a foundation stone upon which empires are built. And so, the eunuch system was not simply a quirk of ancient China. It was a manifestation of a universal horror, the willingness of societies to mutilate the vulnerable in the name of survival and power. The story of childhood sold and cut away is not a relic of the past, but a mirror, showing us the depths to which humanity descends when power is worshipped above life itself. As the chapter closes, one truth emerges with chilling clarity. These were not isolated tragedies, but systemic sacrifices, repeated generation after generation until mutilation itself became tradition. The palace gates closed behind them, and their screams faded into memory. What entered those walls was not a child, not a servant, but something else entirely, a life remade by horror, a body reshaped into silence. Childhoods for sale, futures erased for the empire's hunger. And from these wounds, history would give birth to shadows more dangerous than the men who created them. The palace walls did not merely separate the imperial family from the world beyond. They also swallowed the eunuchs whole. Once a boy was cut and delivered into this vast labyrinth, he ceased to exist in the eyes of his village, his family, and sometimes even his own name. Inside, he was reborn, not as a man, not as a woman, but as something suspended between categories. A servant who lived in silence, and a shadow who learned to move without being seen. It was a transformation more terrifying than the mutilation itself, for it was not only the body that was altered, but the soul, reshaped by an architecture of isolation and suspicion. The palace was a world ruled by whispers. Every corridor hummed with secrets, every chamber stank of fear disguised as perfume. Here, the eunuch was assigned a purpose as unnatural as his body. He became the watcher of women. Locked inside the emperor's harem, he dressed them, bathed them, carried their letters and perfumes, their laughter and their tears. In the eyes of the court, he was trusted precisely because he had been destroyed. His mutilation became his credential. Yet the horror lingered. The palace demanded he exist in intimate proximity to sexuality while being eternally barred from it. Desire was forbidden, but desire lingered. Repression metastasized into something darker. To the emperor, the eunuch was useful because he was expendable. He could not found a dynasty. He could not threaten bloodlines, and yet he could be sent into the innermost chambers of imperial life. The emperor's concubines often knew no man's touch but their lord's, and the eunuch who washed them. This dynamic, repeated over centuries, produced a society of warped intimacies. The eunuch's hands became tools of service, but his eyes became tools of surveillance. He watched what no other man could watch. He listened where no other voice was permitted. His silence was not submission, it was survival. And in silence, knowledge grew. Every step he took in the palace lengthened the shadow he cast. He learned to glide unseen, memorizing which concubine was favored and which was ignored, which handmaid whispered rebellion and which plotted seduction. Knowledge of desire became his weapon, more dangerous than any blade, but this power was not free. It came at the price of his humanity. The eunuch was never allowed to be seen as an equal. To courtiers he was a ghost in flesh, an object of ridicule, a reminder of shame. To concubines he was a half-man, pitied one moment and despised the next. To himself he was caught between the horror of mutilation and the intoxication of influence. The transformation from mutilated boy to political instrument was gradual, but relentless. Suspicion clung to eunuchs like a second skin. If a concubine became pregnant at the wrong time, suspicion fell upon them. If an emperor's lust waned, whispers blamed the eunuchs who interfered. Punishments were swift and cruel: torture, exile, execution. Yet for every eunuch destroyed, another stepped forward, feeding the machine of secrecy. Fear itself became the currency of the palace, and eunuchs were both its merchants and its slaves. In the deepest chambers of this world, sexuality never vanished. Instead, it returned as rumor, perversion, and grotesque invention. Some eunuchs were said to forge artificial devices, desperate substitutes for what they had lost, seeking ways to satisfy both themselves and the women they served. Others sought intimacy through manipulation, forcing women into secret pacts under threat of exposure. Every rumor, whether true or exaggerated, grew in power precisely because it was unspeakable. The eunuch embodied contradiction, stripped of manhood, yet forever bound to the erotic heart of the empire. His very existence was a paradox made flesh, a silent horror built into the architecture of Chinese dynasties. Psychologically, this existence was a crucifixion without death. To be mutilated is to suffer once. To live as a eunuch in the palace was to be mutilated daily. Every time he entered the harem, every time he touched silk and perfume but could never partake in the pleasures of flesh, the wound reopened. He was forced to serve the desires of others while his own body had been sentenced to absence. This is why the eunuch's gaze became so powerful. It was the gaze of the denied, watching hungrily, resentfully, and endlessly, and through that gaze, entire empires were compromised. But the shadows lengthened further still. With generations, eunuchs learned to cultivate not only secrets but entire systems of control. A eunuch who understood the rhythm of the emperor's desires could manipulate the order of the court. By deciding which concubine entered the bedchamber and which remained outside, he could alter dynasties. Children yet unborn depended on his silent nod. Bloodlines rose or fell because a eunuch whispered at the right ear or blocked the wrong name. In this sense, the mutilated servant became a kingmaker. His body may have been cut, but his shadow stretched across the throne itself. This transformation left a scar not only on the eunuchs themselves, but on the society that produced them. Ordinary people came to fear them, to see them as creatures of corruption, symbols of a court where nature was violated and power was perverted. Mothers threatened disobedient sons with the fate of castration. Ballads and poems mocked eunuchs as unnatural monsters. Yet, paradoxically, rulers continued to rely upon them, feeding the cycle of cruelty. The more society dehumanized eunuchs, the more these mutilated men learned to manipulate humanity itself. The palace became a theater where the actors had been cut in order to serve the play. The eunuch's journey from servant to shadow was, in truth, a descent. What began as mutilation became a philosophy of existence: to survive without flesh, to thrive without recognition, to dominate without acknowledgement. And so, they became the ghosts of empire. Neither man nor woman, neither free nor enslaved, neither powerless nor truly sovereign. Their very ambiguity was their strength. Their very loss became their weapon. But the price was heavy, and it was not paid only by them. It was paid by concubines forced to live under their gaze, by emperors whose thrones were manipulated from the shadows, by dynasties that rotted under the weight of secrets. The eunuch was not merely a mutilated body, he was a living reminder of how empires mutilate themselves when they sacrifice humanity for control. And in the silence of the palace, those shadows grew longer, preparing for the horrors yet to come. They were called safe. That was the greatest lie. The palace believed that by cutting the flesh of boys, by spilling their manhood into the dirt, they had erased desire. What remained, it was said, were hollowed-out bodies, servants stripped of hunger, guardians incapable of lust. Thus, the women of the emperor, the most guarded, coveted, and fragile possessions of the realm, were handed into their keeping. Day after day, night after night, eunuchs bathed them, clothed them, combed their hair, massaged their limbs. Their mutilated hands became the only male hands permitted to touch imperial skin. What was thought to be neutral became, instead, a grotesque theater of repression. For the most dangerous desire is not the one openly indulged, it is the one denied, mutilated, forced underground until it grows monstrous. The forbidden city lived by its own laws of flesh and silence. The concubines, hundreds, sometimes thousands, were prisoners of satin, confined in golden cages. To them, the eunuchs were omnipresent shadows, moving silently through chambers scented with incense and sweat. To be a eunuch in this space was to be forever reminded of absence. Every curve glimpsed, every scent inhaled, every bare shoulder brushed against the hand was a tormenting echo of what had been stolen. Castration had severed their bodies, but not their minds, not their capacity to feel hunger in the marrow of their being. It did not extinguish lust, it warped it into obsession. The eunuchs lived among the most beautiful women in the empire, yet could never act as men. The cruelty of this paradox gnawed at them, bending their humanity into twisted shapes. Rumors festered within palace walls like rot beneath silk. Concubines whispered of hands that lingered too long during a bath, of eunuchs whose gazes grew heavy with unspoken hunger. There were stories of stolen moments in darkened corridors, of desperate women reaching out for intimacy in a place where they were little more than possessions. Some concubines found in eunuchs a secret tenderness, the possibility of a human bond unsupervised by the emperor's jealous gaze. But every caress carried risk, for discovery meant execution, sometimes for the concubine, sometimes for the eunuch, often for both. Yet the risk itself fed the perversion, turning secrecy into an intoxicant. A forbidden touch was no longer a human act of closeness, but a rebellion against the empire's most sacred boundaries. The eunuchs themselves developed methods to navigate their mutilated state. Some relied on touch alone, others on cruel substitutes, mocking the very intimacy denied to them. Desire, stripped of its natural course, re-emerged in grotesque forms. There are accounts of eunuchs experimenting with objects, forcing humiliations on concubines that blurred the line between service and violation. Pleasure and cruelty mingled until they became indistinguishable, each caress a reminder of both longing and revenge. For every act of intimacy was a protest against the blade that had cut them and against the emperor who ruled both their bodies and their futures. Yet beneath these acts lay another truth, darker still. The emperor himself had engineered this twisted system. By surrounding his women with mutilated men, he believed he was protecting his lineage, ensuring that no bastard child could threaten the throne. But in doing so, he created a hothouse of perversion where mutilation and repression fused into obsession. The palace became a breeding ground for warped desires, a world where neither the concubine nor the eunuch was truly free. Both were prisoners, one gilded, one mutilated, bound together by chains of power and absence. History leaves us fragments of these forbidden bonds. Scandals erupted when eunuchs were discovered in illicit contact with concubines. Sometimes these were acts of passion, sometimes of violence, often of desperation. The punishments were horrific. Concubines drowned in silk shrouds, eunuchs executed in ways designed to mock their mutilation. The cruelty of these punishments served as theater, a reminder to all others of what could not be spoken, let alone acted upon. Yet each scandal also revealed the futility of repression. For every execution, another whisper rose. For every body drowned, another hidden hunger persisted. The system devoured its own victims, yet could never destroy the forces it sought to suppress. Psychologically, the horror lay in the contradiction. The eunuchs were emasculated, yet forced into roles that constantly reminded them of sexuality. They were denied intimacy, yet commanded to facilitate it for others. They were neither fully men nor fully free, existing in a liminal state that eroded their humanity. Over time, many became cruel, bitter, prone to humiliating those around them. Others turned inward, dissolving into despair. In both cases, castration had not removed desire. It had poisoned it, making every breath in the women's chambers a reminder of absence turned into torment. What emerges from this chapter of history is not merely scandal, but a philosophical horror. When a society seeks to control human desire by mutilation, it does not destroy lust. It breeds monstrosities. By stripping eunuchs of their manhood and forcing them to serve as guardians of flesh, the empire created creatures of paradox, men without manhood who became arbiters of intimacy. Every act of repression became fertile soil for perversion. And in this grotesque theater, the concubines themselves were not only victims of the emperor's possessiveness, but of the eunuch's obsessions, forced to navigate a labyrinth of desire, fear, and punishment. In the end, the legacy of eunuchs in the chambers of the emperor is a mirror of power itself. Power, when built upon mutilation and control, does not create purity. It creates shadows, where human instincts return twisted, violent, and unrecognizable. The eunuchs, forced to live among forbidden flesh, embodied this truth. They were both victims and violators, products of cruelty who became agents of further cruelty. And as history would reveal, their presence in the palace was not merely a grotesque detail of ancient life, it was a slow poison, corroding the very foundations of empire. The forbidden flesh was not just a chapter in the lives of eunuchs, it was a chapter in the collapse of dynasties. For when desire is mutilated but not destroyed, it will always find a way back, through whispers, through perversions, through violence. And the palaces of emperors became mausoleums of this truth, echoing with the silent torment of men who were told they were safe, but who carried within them the most dangerous hunger of all. The palace was no longer a court of order. It was a theater, a grotesque stage upon which mutilated men performed unspeakable acts to prove their dominance. To survive in a world where they had been stripped of the most primal aspect of their humanity, eunuchs invented roles, costumes, and rituals that mocked the very body that had been stolen from them. In these performances, pain became comedy, humiliation became ceremony, and sexuality once denied, returned as a shadow, twisted and redefined in ways that left permanent scars upon the women, the court, and the empire itself. There is a cruelty born not from strength, but from loss. Eunuchs embodied this paradox. The knife that robbed them of virility did not erase desire. It fractured it, turning it inward until it festered and emerged in distorted displays. Many eunuchs wore feminine garments, powdered their faces, and adopted mannerisms designed to both ridicule and embrace their broken state. It was theater, a parody of gender, played out in the candlelit halls of palaces that had become laboratories of perversion. These were not men nor women, but living reminders of mutilation, bodies re-scripted into grotesque roles for the amusement of those above them and for the torment of those below. Yet the most disturbing spectacles were not in the public eye. Behind the closed doors of the harem, eunuchs presided over humiliations that blurred the line between ritual and abuse. Concubines, who themselves were prisoners of the emperor's appetite, found their lives increasingly subject to the cruel imagination of their keepers. Some eunuchs devised degrading contests, forcing women to crawl, to beg, to play obscene games under the guise of entertainment. Others invented substitutions for intimacy, grotesque simulations that mocked the act they themselves could never perform. Where once their bodies had been violated by the blade, now they wielded violation as their only form of control. The palace became a place where sexuality was not extinguished, but weaponized. Eunuchs, denied the act of reproduction, turned to domination as their theater of fertility. They could not father children, but they could orchestrate acts that reminded concubines of their helplessness. It was a revenge enacted not only upon the women, but upon the empire itself. The emperor's harem, meant to be the sanctum of dynastic continuity, became instead a carnival of humiliation, overseen by men who had been mutilated into silence but had rediscovered their voice in perverse spectacle. These rituals of cruelty were not merely indulgences, they were political statements. Every humiliation staged in the harem was a declaration that the eunuch was not powerless, that the knife had not destroyed them, but transformed them into something far more dangerous. Their authority lay not in their flesh, but in their ability to corrupt the sacred spaces of empire. By turning loyalty into orgy and service into degradation, they inverted the very order of the palace. They mocked the emperor by mocking his women, using the theater of perversion as both rebellion and revenge. The psychological cost was immeasurable. For the concubines, already stripped of agency, the presence of eunuchs became a double imprisonment. They were watched, touched, ordered, and debased by men who bore the scars of mutilation, men who reminded them daily that their bodies were commodities in a system built on flesh and silence. For the eunuchs themselves, the theater was both punishment and release. Each grotesque performance was a way to affirm their existence in a world that had reduced them to nothing. The perversions were not accidents of decadence. They were survival mechanisms, strategies of identity carved out in the shadow of the blade. History records the whispers of these acts with both fascination and horror. Accounts describe eunuchs who forced concubines to perform humiliating dances, parades of mock weddings, or simulations of childbirth staged as entertainment. Others demanded rituals of devotion, where women were made to treat their eunuch masters as gods, showering affection upon mutilated bodies in spectacles of mock intimacy. These were acts not of pleasure but of domination, designed to reverse the wound of emasculation by inflicting wounds upon others. In the theater of perversion, cruelty was applause, and humiliation the script. Philosophically, the spectacle reveals something darker about the human condition. When stripped of one form of power, people invent another. Deprived of manhood, eunuchs reinvented masculinity as theater louder, crueler, and more grotesque than nature had ever intended. The palace was the crucible in which this experiment was conducted, a place where the mutilated became playwrights of degradation. Their performances remind us that sexuality, when suppressed by violence, does not vanish, it mutates into a shadow, a weapon turned against others. The climax of this theater was not found in laughter but in silence. Behind the walls of the Forbidden City and countless other palaces, generations of women carried the scars of rituals designed to remind them of their subjugation. The eunuchs, robbed of their own lineage, left no children to bear their names. Their legacy was instead written upon the bodies and souls of those they tormented, a lineage of trauma that echoed through dynastic collapse. As dynasties rotted under the weight of corruption, the theater of perversion became both symbol and cause. The empire itself was humiliated as eunuchs staged grotesque performances in its sacred spaces. What began as individual acts of cruelty metastasized into institutional decay until the harem became less a sanctuary of dynasty than a circus of degradation. By then, the stage was no longer hidden. It had infected the empire's very foundations. And so, the theater of perversion was more than spectacle. It was prophecy. It foretold the collapse of a system that believed mutilation could be harnessed for order. By turning loyalty into cruelty and intimacy into humiliation, the eunuchs revealed the true cost of empire's obsession with control. What had begun with the knife ended in ritualized horror, and what had been designed to preserve the dynasty became one of its most poisonous cancers. The chapter closes with a chilling reminder. The theater of perversion was not confined to the palace of emperors long gone. It is a mirror held to every system that mutilates human beings for power, that forces the wounded to become performers of cruelty in order to survive. The eunuchs remind us that when flesh is broken, spirit can twist into something darker, and that the stage of history is littered not with heroes and villains, but with mutilated actors forced to play roles in a theater no one dares to remember. It began with silence, but it ended with whispers. Once the blade had severed their flesh, once their cries had echoed and vanished into the stone walls of the palace, eunuchs were left with something far sharper than any sword, the power of observation. Forbidden from fathering children, stripped of manhood and lineage, they learned to cultivate a different kind of legacy knowledge. In a court where lust and betrayal pulsed beneath the silken curtains of the emperor's chambers, knowledge of sexual secrets was the most dangerous weapon of all. And eunuchs held it in their mutilated hands, The palace was a world of shadows, and every shadow was alive with intrigue. Eunuchs, moving quietly through corridors, carried towels, poured wine, dressed concubines, and waited outside the emperor's chambers. They seemed invisible, their mutilated bodies a reminder of their supposed harmlessness. But this very invisibility made them the perfect spies. They saw everything: the concubine who dared to slip a letter to a court official, the emperor who visited the same favorite night after night in violation of ritual balance, the forbidden touch exchanged between women in lonely hours. Secrets dripped constantly, and eunuchs collected them like blood in a basin. The more they observed, the more they realized that sex denied to them was the true currency of the empire. They could not partake in it, but they could destroy others with it. A whispered accusation of infidelity could send a concubine to the executioner's blade. A carefully timed revelation could end a nobleman's career. Entire clans fell because a eunuch chose to reveal an affair, while others rose because a eunuch remained silent. In this grotesque theater, emasculated men became the masters of desire, pulling the strings while outwardly appearing powerless. Their lack of organs no longer mattered, because their dominion came from what they knew rather than what they could do. There is a particular cruelty in this inversion. Castrated men, robbed of their ability to experience flesh, became arbiters of flesh. Forbidden to father children, they became fathers of rumor and scandal. Their own mutilation sharpened their hunger to control others' intimacy. In their bitterness, some eunuchs seemed to relish exposing the hypocrisy of those who thought themselves untouchable. They could ruin an emperor's night, or turn a favorite concubine into a corpse with only a whisper. This was not power rooted in armies, banners, or bloodlines. It was power rooted in shame. The court became a labyrinth of fear. Every touch between lovers risked discovery. Every look carried suspicion. Eunuchs, outwardly neutral, were feared as predators of privacy. Officials bribed them with gold to conceal affairs. Concubines begged them for silence. Even emperors could not escape, for eunuchs often recorded their nocturnal activities, ensuring balance among women in the harem. The emperor, who lay too often with one favorite, risked accusations of imbalance and loss of the mandate of heaven. And who delivered this news? The eunuchs. They were no longer shadows in the palace. They had become its pulse. The consequences of their empire of secrets stretched beyond individual lives. As eunuchs gained control over who was exposed and who was spared, they became political arbiters. They could secure promotions for allies, destroy rivals, or even orchestrate the fall of entire families. And because their power was rooted in knowledge, it was almost impossible to challenge. Accuse a eunuch of lies, and they would simply release another secret, exposing the accuser to ruin. Their empire was built not on stone or steel, but on the fragility of human lust. What is most horrifying is how quickly society accepted this order. The mutilated men who had once been despised became indispensable because they alone could navigate the empire of flesh without appearing to threaten it. Yet the threat they posed was far greater than any rival general. They created a culture of paranoia where love itself became dangerous and intimacy a liability. The most private act between two people, meant to bind, to comfort, to give life, was twisted into a tool of control, a bargaining chip, a noose. The personal became political in the darkest way imaginable. As dynasties aged and the weight of corruption grew heavier, eunuchs became more brazen. Some hoarded records of indiscretions, scrolls filled with names and accusations, locked away as insurance against betrayal. Others weaponized rumors deliberately, sowing chaos to weaken the court, knowing only they could navigate the resulting storms. The palace ceased to be a place of loyalty and became instead a marketplace of secrets. Eunuchs sold silence to the highest bidder, enriching themselves as they tightened their grip on power. The psychological horror of this cannot be overstated. To be ruled not by the emperor, not by law or morality, but by the mutilated gaze of eunuchs who saw and remembered everything, was to live in a permanent state of exposure. There was no privacy. There was no safety. Even the emperor, the supposed son of heaven, became a prisoner of his own indulgence, watched and recorded by the very servants who had once bowed before him. This was the eunuch's revenge. They had been cut to serve, but they found power in the one place no blade could touch: the vulnerability of human desire. And yet, this empire of secrets could not last forever. As whispers grew louder, as eunuchs amassed more control than emperors themselves, the palace began to rot from within. Distrust consumed loyalty, paranoia eroded governance, and the state itself weakened under the weight of constant blackmail and betrayal. What had begun as a tool of control became a poison in the bloodstream of empire. The eunuch's domination was not merely personal, it was systemic, infecting the dynasty itself. But even as dynasties collapsed, the scars remained. The eunuch's power lived on as legend, a reminder that the most horrifying empires are not always built with armies or walls, but with secrets. Their story forces us to confront an unsettling truth that what is hidden, what is whispered, what is unspoken, often wields more power than what is openly declared. And when power is built on silence and shame, it always ends in corruption and ruin. By the height of dynastic corruption, the balance of power in China's imperial palaces had shifted in ways that defied both nature and reason. The emperor's sons of heaven, believed to hold divine mandate over millions of subjects, found themselves entangled, controlled, and in many cases completely enslaved by men who no longer even possessed the instruments of manhood. The eunuchs, mutilated in childhood, had once been marked by their absence. Yet within the hidden corridors of the Forbidden City, it was precisely this absence, this emptiness, that had become the very essence of their terrifying strength. The eunuchs dictated not only the rhythm of court politics, but the rhythm of the emperor's flesh. They decided who would warm the imperial bed, which concubines would be touched, which would be abandoned to jealousy and despair. Behind every silken curtain, every whisper of satin robes, it was the eunuchs, not the emperor, who pulled the strings of desire. The emperor, the most powerful man in the world, was reduced to a puppet whose pleasures, whose very experience of intimacy, were orchestrated by those whose own sexuality had been stolen with a blade. The irony was brutal. Those mutilated in body had mastered the empire of the body itself. This transformation did not happen suddenly. It crept in slowly, like rot beneath gilded paint. Eunuchs, by their very position, were entrusted with proximity to what was most forbidden: women, secrets, and the emperor himself. Their lives, emptied of natural family and offspring, were instead filled with the insatiable pursuit of influence. And influence began where desire burned hottest. A eunuch who controlled the emperor's nights controlled his mornings, his councils, his wars. For a man deprived of the pleasures of his own body, there was no power more intoxicating than to determine the pleasures of the throne. Some emperors submitted willingly. In the shadowed hours of the night, a eunuch's whisper could become a song of devotion. There are accounts of emperors who grew to love their eunuchs more than their consorts, cherishing their obedience, their intimacy, their absolute loyalty. In a world where every concubine schemed for her son to inherit the throne, eunuchs offered something different, a bond not built on lineage but on dependence, a twisted form of love born from mutilation. Yet such love was never pure. It was parasitic, feeding on weakness, drawing power from absence. An emperor who surrendered himself in this way ceased to rule. He became ruled. Others resisted, but resistance was useless against the machinery of surveillance eunuchs had constructed. Every movement within the harem was watched, every gesture recorded, every intimacy catalogued. A concubine could rise or fall not because of beauty or wit, but because a eunuch had allowed or denied her access to the emperor's chamber. And the emperor, like a caged beast, often did not realize his cage was built of invisible hands. He believed he was sovereign, even as the eunuchs dictated the script of his nights, setting before him the women who served their purposes, withholding those who might challenge their dominance. The palace, in these times, became not a seat of power but a theater of grotesque perversion. Eunuchs choreographed desire as though arranging ritual. Entire dynasties of women daughters of noble houses, gifts from distant states, were reduced to pawns in the eunuch's game. An emperor's lust could be redirected, suffocated, or inflamed at will. And through this, eunuchs learned the ultimate truth: control over the emperor's body was control over the empire itself. Policy, war, taxation, famine relief, all were shaped by the shifting moods of an emperor whose nights had been scripted by the mutilated men who served him. The horror of this arrangement lay not only in politics but in psychology. Eunuchs, deprived of their manhood, redefined power as the mastery of others' flesh. Their control became the cruel mirror of their own absence. Where their bodies had been mutilated, they now mutilated desire itself, carving intimacy into an instrument of tyranny. For the emperor, each night's embrace became haunted, for he could never be certain whose hand had chosen his partner, whose mind had scripted his passion. Even love itself became tainted, contaminated by invisible manipulation. This distortion of intimacy reached grotesque extremes. Eunuchs were rumored to use their power to humiliate emperors, presenting them with women deliberately tainted by scandal or orchestrating rivalries that poisoned the palace with jealousy. In some accounts, concubines were forced into degrading acts, not for the emperor's desire but for the eunuch's amusement, their laughter echoing like the mocking cry of the mutilated against the mutilator. In these stories, the emperor himself became less than a man, an object controlled, manipulated, toyed with by servants who had transformed mutilation into dominion, and with this dominion came collapse. An emperor ruled by eunuchs ceased to see the empire. Surrounded by orchestrated pleasures, lulled by eunuch whispers, he lost himself in the illusions crafted for him. Dynasties withered as famine spread, armies weakened, and corruption devoured the state. Outside the palace, people starved and rebelled. Inside, the emperor dreamed in silken chambers, not knowing his dreams were written for him by mutilated men whose ambitions knew no end. It is here that we confront the most haunting truth. Power is not merely the ability to command armies or dictate laws. True power lies in the control of intimacy, in the shaping of desire itself. And when that power is wielded by those who have been mutilated physically, psychologically, or spiritually, the results are always grotesque. The eunuchs of Imperial China remind us that when love, sex, and power are corrupted, the empire itself becomes diseased. As dynasties slid toward ruin, the eunuch's grip only tightened, until the emperor himself seemed less like a ruler and more like a prisoner in his own bed. This chapter closes not with liberation, but with entrapment. For what can a man do, even an emperor, when every touch he feels, every glance of affection has been chosen for him by the very servants who mutilated intimacy into an empire of control? The throne of heaven had become a cage, and within it sat not a king, but a captive of the mutilated. The end did not come suddenly. It arrived like rot spreading through the walls of a palace, unseen until the structure collapsed. For centuries, eunuchs had been servants of emperors, guardians of harems, keepers of secrets. But by the twilight of dynasties, they had become something else, parasites feeding on the very body of empire, draining its vitality until there was nothing left but weakness and decay. The system that once mutilated flesh to maintain control had mutilated the state itself, and the empire bled from wounds it could no longer heal. The eunuchs, shaped by the knife, learned to wield power with a precision far sharper than steel. They had begun as broken boys, stripped of manhood, entrusted only with service. Yet their intimacy with the most private chambers of rulers gave them leverage no general nor minister could match. By the decline of the Han and later the Ming, eunuchs whispered in the ears of monarchs, controlled the flow of concubines into the imperial bed, and held in their hands the fragile thread of succession itself. Emperors trusted no one else, for only the mutilated seemed safe from ambition, or so the rulers believed. But ambition had not been removed, it had only been warped. In the late years of the Han, emperors found themselves enthralled by eunuchs who promised loyalty yet trafficked in treachery. Eunuchs assassinated crown princes in the dark of night, strangled concubines with silken cords when jealousy demanded blood, and poisoned emperors who resisted their influence. One ruler was said to have died with his lips stained black, betrayed by the very hands that once bathed him. These horrors were not the deeds of barbarians at the gates, but of attendants within the palace walls. Domestic servants turned executioners, family stewards turned masters of death. The palace itself became a theater of fear. Eunuchs who once carried lamps now carried knives. At feasts, the emperor would drink wine poured by men who smiled while plotting his fall. At night, women of the harem lay awake, listening for the footsteps of eunuchs approaching their chambers, not with gifts or messages, but with orders of death. Silk, the very fabric of imperial luxury, became an instrument of strangulation. The most delicate ribbons, once symbols of refinement, were coiled around pale throats until breath was stolen in silence. Blood left no stain on silk, and so the murders could be hidden as easily as they were committed. As dynasties waned, eunuchs, stripped of their flesh, sought to erase their corruption in fire. When rebellions threatened the Ming palaces, records were torched, archives turned to ash, and bodies burned to dust in futile attempts to conceal the evidence of decades of decadence. In some accounts, concubines were locked in their chambers as flames devoured them, silken robes igniting like funeral torches, their screams muffled behind lacquered doors. Eunuchs, once mutilated to protect imperial purity, now slaughtered the empire's women to protect their own secrets. The palace, built as a monument to heaven's mandate, became a crematorium of flesh and stone. The empire mirrored the eunuchs who ruled it. Just as the eunuch's body was scarred, hollowed, and distorted, so too was the state. Corruption hollowed its institutions, greed scarred its finances, and secrecy distorted its governance. The mutilated body of a eunuch was a metaphor for the mutilated body politic of China itself, an empire that appeared magnificent in silk and jade, but beneath the surface was already decaying. Foreign armies needed only to push gently against the weakened walls to bring dynasties crashing down. This collapse was not simply political, it was cultural trauma, a deep wound upon society. Generations of Chinese families had surrendered sons to castration, had watched them ascend in rank, only to see those same eunuchs contribute to the ruin of the realm. What did it mean to a civilization when those who embodied obedience became architects of corruption? What did it mean for mothers who sold their sons into palaces, only to see the dynasty crumble under their twisted power? The horror was generational. The knife that cut the boy's flesh also cut the empire's future. Psychologically, the eunuch's downfall revealed the darkest paradox. Those denied sexuality became tyrants defined by it. Their obsession with controlling access to women, their manipulation of imperial desire, their jealousies and revenges, all of it grew from the wound carved into their bodies. What emperors thought would neutralize ambition instead created an insatiable hunger, a desire not for children or family, but for domination, humiliation, and annihilation. By removing the manhood of the eunuch, rulers had not removed lust, they had created something darker, a lust for destruction itself. By the final years of dynasties, eunuchs stood above ministers, generals, even emperors themselves. Some emperors were prisoners in their own courts, reduced to figureheads while eunuchs controlled armies and dictated decrees. In the Ming, eunuchs such as Wei Zhongxian were feared more than warlords, his word law, his cruelty legend. He turned temples into shrines to his own power, demanded worship, and executed thousands who opposed him. And when the dynasty fell, he hanged himself with the same silken cords he once ordered others strangled with, a fitting end to a reign of mutilated terror. The collapse of flesh became the collapse of empire. What began as an act of control castration to protect dynasties ended in uncontrollable ruin. Mutilated bodies had produced mutilated politics, and the empire could not survive the infection. In their final moments, emperors burned in their palaces, concubines suffocated in smoke, and eunuchs fled into the night, their twisted legacy carved into history. And yet history tried to bury them. Dynasties that followed outlawed eunuchs, destroyed records, condemned them as demons in human form, but scars remain. Their story is a reminder that systems of power built upon mutilation, secrecy, and perversion cannot endure. Like the eunuch's body, they may survive for a time, but they are forever marked by absence, by distortion, by the horror of what has been removed. The collapse of eunuchs was not just the collapse of men without flesh, it was the collapse of the very idea that power can be preserved through mutilation. And as the flames of palaces consumed the bones of emperors and the ashes of concubines, one truth was revealed. When horror becomes the foundation of rule, it will always devour its creators in the end. The empire's collapse did not end in triumph, nor in redemption. It ended, as so many horrors do, in silence. After centuries of palace intrigues and bloodletting, after dynasties were twisted and broken by men who had been mutilated as children, rulers attempted to cleanse the stain not by justice but by erasure. The decree was simple: eunuchs were to vanish, not only from the court but from history itself. Their names were stricken from records, their deeds rewritten as rumor, their existence reduced to shadows. It was a final punishment more subtle than castration itself, to be denied even the dignity of memory. The new rulers feared them even in death. Edicts were issued to burn archives that listed eunuch officials, to strike their faces from carved tablets, to bury their names beneath dust. Where once eunuchs had wielded absolute power, deciding who lived and who died with a whisper in the emperor's ear, now their very mention was treated as a contagion. It was believed that by erasing the eunuchs, the empire could purify itself, as if the horrors could be dissolved in fire and ash. Yet fire does not heal wounds. It only leaves scars blackened and more visible to those who dare to look. This attempt at forgetting was itself an act of violence. For the eunuchs were not monsters by birth. They were boys, mutilated, robbed, and forced into lives of grotesque service. To erase them was to erase also the families that sold them, the dynasties that exploited them, the women they guarded, the emperors they manipulated, the entire machinery of suffering that sustained an empire's pleasure. Silence became complicity, a shield against accountability. What could not be confessed was smothered. And so the eunuchs became ghosts, social, cultural, and in the most haunting sense, literal. Folk tales emerged of palaces haunted by eunuchs who refused to stay dead. Servants spoke of voices echoing down deserted corridors, of pale figures without eyes or tongues, of footsteps following at night. Their mutilation became the symbol of their eternal unrest, spirits forever incomplete, wandering the halls they once ruled, whispering secrets no emperor wanted heard. In these ghost stories, one hears not mere superstition, but the unspoken guilt of a civilization. The people knew what had been done. They knew innocence had been sacrificed, futures had been destroyed, lives reduced to tools, and so memory returned as horror. Philosophically, the erasure of eunuchs reveals the paradox of power. An empire capable of manufacturing an entire class of mutilated men could not bear to remember what it had done. Instead of learning from the horror, it attempted to bury it. This reveals a truth that spans across civilizations. Societies do not always atone for their crimes. They suffocate them under silence, trusting time to dull the edges. But silence does not cleanse, it festers. The very act of erasure ensured the eunuchs would never truly vanish, for what is buried without ritual, without confession, without truth, inevitably haunts the living. In historical records that remain, the eunuchs flicker in and out of existence like shadows against flame. Their names appear only when they betray an emperor or die violently, and then the line cuts abruptly, as if history itself looks away. This fractured memory is itself a form of psychological violence, the refusal to grant even recognition of existence, the attempt to condemn men not only in life, but for eternity. And yet, even as emperors sought to obliterate them, the very structure of the palace remained infused with their absence. Who guarded the harems now? Who watched over the emperor's bed? Their duties did not vanish, only their acknowledgement did. A society must live with its crimes, even when it dares not speak them aloud. The erasure also speaks to fear. To remember the eunuchs was to remember that the empire's power had been built on mutilated children. To admit their existence was to admit the empire's moral rot. So the eunuchs were transformed into silence, into unspeakable things, monstrous, dangerous, cursed. The same empire that once trusted them with its most intimate secrets now feared even the memory of their whispers. This fear was the final tribute to their power, that even dead, they terrified emperors enough to be erased. Yet trauma does not vanish when it is silenced. Like a festering wound hidden beneath bandages, it seeps into culture. Poems hinted at their absence, folk songs carried veiled references to their suffering, and ghost stories ensured they were remembered in the way all unconfessed sins are remembered, through horror. The eunuchs became an eternal warning, living proof that power, when built upon perversion, will not only collapse but leave behind scars deeper than any conquest. Their mutilation echoed beyond their lives, shaping how future dynasties feared intimacy, how rulers distrusted servants, how an entire society inherited paranoia. In this silence lies the greatest cruelty. To erase a people is to deny them humanity twice, first in life, through violence, and second in death, through forgetting. But the unspoken always returns. Modern historians digging through scattered records find traces, edicts that mention them obliquely, rumors that survive destruction, bones buried without dignity. And in these fragments, one sees the futility of erasure. Memory is a river. It may be dammed, diverted, or buried underground, but it always resurfaces. And when it does, it brings with it the horror of everything that was once denied. The eunuchs of ancient China embody this paradox of silence and haunting. Their names were burned, their records erased, but their legacy remains as an open wound in cultural memory. They are remembered not as individuals, but as symbols of mutilation, of secrecy, of the empire's own crimes. The attempt to erase them ensured they became unforgettable, for what society refuses to face, it will always fear. And so, the eunuchs linger in the unspoken, neither alive nor fully dead, neither human nor erased, a reminder that atrocities cannot be hidden, only transformed into ghosts. The chapter closes with the recognition that every empire attempts erasure when confronted with its own perversions. Some burn the records, others bury the dead without markers. But history itself remembers. The silence of the eunuchs still whispers through time, a warning to us. What we refuse to acknowledge, we will inherit as haunting. History is not merciful. It does not soften its lessons, nor does it disguise its cruelty. The legacy of the eunuchs of ancient China is not simply the story of mutilated men or corrupted courts. It is the reflection of humanity itself, when stripped bare of dignity, identity, and choice. Their lives, carved apart with a blade, became testaments to the capacity of power to deform not only the body, but the very soul of a civilization. And as much as dynasties attempted to bury the memory of these servants, their shadow remains, haunting us with the reminder that what was done to them has been done, in other forms, across centuries and continents. The eunuchs were created as tools of obedience, men transformed into something less than men, fashioned into guardians of kings and concubines. Their bodies were deliberately destroyed so that their loyalty would not be divided between bloodlines and families. They were meant to be safe, sterile extensions of the throne. But what the architects of this system did not anticipate, or perhaps did not care to consider, was that mutilation does not erase desire, it mutates it. It festers in silence, turns inward, and corrupts. By weaponizing mutilation, emperors thought they created servants without ambition. In truth, they created a ruling class of shadows who learned to wield secrets as weapons sharper than any blade. The legacy of castration, then, is not simply the story of broken men, but of the societies that tolerated their creation. Entire dynasties willingly sacrificed thousands of children to the knife, accepting mutilation as the price of empire. The parents who sold their sons, the officials who enforced decrees, the physicians who carried out the butchery, all participated in a ritual of erasure, one that traded humanity for control. And this is perhaps the most horrifying truth. The system of eunuchs was not imposed by one tyrant alone, but by the collective acquiescence of millions, generation after generation, who allowed the knife to keep falling. To understand their legacy, we must linger on the scars they left. Castration was more than the loss of organs. It was the annihilation of lineage. These men could never father children, never continue their bloodlines, never pass on names that had been spoken for centuries. Their families ended with them, extinguished in silence. And this, too, was part of the cruelty. Dynasties ensured that loyalty to the throne outlived loyalty to kin. In stripping away the possibility of posterity, the state claimed absolute dominion over life itself. What greater act of power could there be than severing not just flesh, but the future? Yet the eunuchs themselves were not merely victims. They became architects of horror in their own right. Denied natural outlets for ambition, desire, and identity, they turned to manipulation, cruelty, and decadence. They destroyed reputations with whispers, strangled concubines in silk, and brought down dynasties with intrigues spun from chambers hidden from sunlight. Their legacy, then, is not only that of mutilation, but of perversion, a perversion born from their suffering, yet inflicted back upon the world. They remind us that when human nature is deliberately twisted, the result is never docility, but monstrosity. The echoes of this system reverberate far beyond ancient China. The eunuchs may have vanished, but the principle that produced them remains. Power always seeks to deform human beings into instruments. The methods change, the blade replaced by indoctrination, the loss of organs replaced by the loss of individuality. But the aim is the same, to erase identity in the name of obedience. Modern societies may not mutilate flesh with knives, but they mutilate spirit with systems that demand conformity, silence, and subservience. The eunuchs remind us of this truth. Whenever humanity is sacrificed for the convenience of power, something unnatural is born. Philosophers often ask whether history is progress or repetition. The eunuchs of ancient China provide a chilling answer. The forms may change, but the impulses do not. The castrated servant whispering in the ear of a distracted emperor is no different from the bureaucrat manipulating leaders today, or the corporation stripping workers of dignity for profit, or the government demanding submission in exchange for safety. The same psychological mutilation repeats, refined, disguised, but always rooted in the same hunger, control through dehumanization. In the end, the legacy of castration is not confined to dusty chronicles. It is alive in the way we accept the erosion of identity around us. Every time a society demands silence, every time ambition is twisted by fear, every time humanity is traded for order, the story of the eunuchs repeats. Their mutilation was physical, ours is often spiritual, but the scars remain the same, scars etched into the memory of cultures that chose stability over dignity, obedience over freedom, survival over humanity. And so the eunuchs endure, not as ghosts wandering palace ruins, but as symbols. They stand as a mirror, forcing us to look at ourselves and ask what we are willing to cut away in the name of control. Their absence of flesh becomes our absence of courage. Their silence becomes our complicity. The horror of their creation is not a relic of a distant empire. It is a warning written in blood, whispering that every society, no matter how modern, risks mutilating itself when it allows power to go unquestioned. The eunuchs may be gone, their bodies dust, their voices silenced, but their legacy endures, heavy and unsettling. It lingers in every institution that demands obedience through fear, in every system that erases individuality to preserve authority. It is the echo of the blade, still descending century after century. And it asks us one final, terrifying question: how much of our humanity are we willing to sacrifice before we too become shadows?